Moving into our new house was the fresh start I had been waiting for. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had finally found a place that felt right. After months of hunting, we came across this two-story house in a quiet neighborhood, tucked away from all the noise of the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. And the best part? The garage. I could already see it becoming my ultimate workshop, a place where I could escape and work on all the projects I had been putting off. It was massive, with enough space for all my tools, equipment, and whatever else I wanted to set up. I couldn't wait. The first week was all about unpacking. Sarah focused on getting the kitchen and bedrooms in order, while I claimed the garage. We were exhausted every night, barely making it through dinner before crashing on the couch. By the third day, I decided it was time to tackle my new domain, the garage. I dragged out my toolboxes and some old boxes we hadn't sorted through yet and got to work. There was this old workbench that the previous owners had left behind. It was this huge, solid thing, covered in layers of dust like no one had touched it for years. It looked like it had seen better days, stains, scratches, all kinds of wear, but I figured I'd clean it up later. It was heavy, though, too heavy to bother moving at that moment, so I left it where it was against the back wall and started unpacking my tools around it. That's when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, just a soft thud like something had fallen over behind me. I paused for a second, listening, but shrugged it off. I figured it was just a box settling or something shifting around. No big deal. Later that night, though, it happened again. Sarah and I were on the couch, halfway through some random TV show, when I heard it again. This time, it was louder, a clear, distinct thud from the garage. Sarah looked at me, her eyes asking the question. She didn't have to speak. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. "Probably just some of the boxes falling over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll check it out in the morning." She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was a little uneasy. Honestly, I was too, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. New house, old place, weird noises, it all made sense, right? Houses creak and settle, garages are full of stuff that shifts around. No reason to worry. But even as I tried to focus back on the TV, I couldn't help but feel like something wasn't quite right. The noise had been too deliberate, too sharp, and for some reason, I kept thinking about that old workbench sitting there in the dark garage, untouched for who knows how long. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the thought of that heavy, dusty workbench wouldn't leave me alone. I'd check it out in the morning, I told myself again. Whatever it was, it could wait. That first night after setting up the garage, things started getting strange. It wasn't just the occasional noise anymore. There was a different kind of tension in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the exhaustion of the move, but Sarah wasn't as easy to convince. We were sitting in the living room, trying to relax. Sarah had her legs curled up under a blanket, and we were halfway through some old rerun when we heard it again. A scraping sound, this time louder, more pronounced than the thud from earlier. It came from the garage, no doubt about it. We both froze for a moment, glancing at each other. "You heard that, right?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep calm. "Probably just something falling over. The garage is a mess. I'll check it out tomorrow." I wanted to sound casual, like it was no big deal, but something about the sound unsettled me. It wasn't just a box falling or something shifting. It was different, like something was deliberately moving in there. Still, I didn't want to admit that to myself, let alone Sarah, so I pushed the feeling down. We tried to get back to the show, but the mood had shifted. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the door that led to the garage, waiting for another sound. The tension in the room was thick, and I could tell Sarah wasn't feeling comfortable either. She kept fidgeting with the blanket, eyes flicking between me and the hallway that led to the garage. "Do you think maybe? I don't know, we should check," she asked finally, not sounding too eager to actually go look. I shook my head. "It's nothing. I'll deal with it in the morning." But the longer we sat there, the more I regretted saying that. It felt like whatever was in the garage wasn't going to wait for morning. As if on cue, the noise came again, a sharper, louder scraping sound, like metal being dragged across concrete. This time, it made my heart race. Sarah shot me a look, and I could see she was genuinely freaked out. "Harrison, seriously, something's wrong. That doesn't sound normal." I sighed. more to calm myself down than anything. All right, fine. I'll go check it out. It's probably nothing. I grabbed my phone for a flashlight and made my way to the garage door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a second longer than it should have, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I wasn't scared, at least that's what I kept telling myself, but something about that sound had my nerves on edge. I opened the door slowly, half expecting something to jump out at me. The garage was dark, with only the faint light from the street lamp outside filtering through the small window. I switched on my phone's flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Nothing. Everything was just as I had left it. The boxes were still piled in the corner, my tools were still scattered on the floor, and that old workbench stood there, heavy and unmoving. But the air felt thick, almost like the room was holding its breath. I stepped inside, shining the light around, searching for anything that could have made that noise. I checked the boxes, kicked a few around to make sure they weren't unstable, and tapped on the walls to see if there was something loose. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing, the workbench. I walked over to it, shining my light underneath. The boxes I had shoved there earlier were untouched, but when I stood back up, I noticed something strange on the surface of the bench. Dust. Not just a light coating like before, but this perfect, undisturbed layer of dust. It was weird because everything else in the garage seemed normal, but the workbench, it was like it hadn't been touched in decades. I ran my hand across the surface, leaving a clean streak in the dust. There was no explanation for it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that bench. I stared at it for a moment longer, waiting for, something, but nothing happened. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. I was just overthinking. I turned off the flashlight and walked back to the house, forcing a grin when I saw Sarah waiting anxiously in the hallway. See? Just a bunch of junk. Probably the wind or something. Everything's fine, I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. She didn't look convinced. You sure? That noise, it didn't sound like just the wind. Yeah, it's an old house. Stuff creaks. Don't worry about it. We went to bed after that, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that scraping sound again in my head. I tossed and turned, trying to shake the weird feeling that the garage wasn't as empty as I convinced myself. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the stress of the move catching up with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong with that garage, and whatever it wasn't going to stay quiet for long. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. The sounds, the eerie feeling I got in the garage, it all stuck with me, no matter how hard I tried to brush it off. Sarah didn't bring it up over breakfast, but I could tell she hadn't slept well either. There was an unspoken tension between us, and I think we were both waiting for the other to say something. But we didn't. Instead, we went through the motions of unpacking and settling in, trying to pretend like everything was fine. By the afternoon, I found myself back in the garage. I hadn't planned on going in there, but something about that place was pulling me in. I wanted to understand what had happened the night before, and more importantly, I wanted to convince myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I stood in the center of the garage, looking around. The sunlight streamed in through the small window, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything seemed normal. The boxes were still piled up, the tools were scattered where I had left them, and the workbench looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. But that was the problem. It was too still, too untouched. I walked over to it again, running my hand along the dusty surface. As I did, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before. Beneath the layer of dust, there were scratches, deep, jagged lines that ran across the top of the workbench. They looked like they had been made by something sharp, something that had clawed or dragged across the wood. The weird thing was they didn't look old. The scratches were fresh, like they had been made recently, but I hadn't noticed them when I first started setting up the garage. I leaned in closer, tracing the lines with my fingers. They were uneven, almost erratic, like someone or something had been trying to scratch its way through the wood. My first thought was that maybe the previous owner had done it. Maybe he was working on some project and scratched up the surface. But that didn't make sense. The marks didn't look like they had been made by any tool I could think of. I stepped back, staring at the bench, trying to make sense of it. That's when I noticed more scratches. This time, they were on the side of the bench, just underneath the surface. They were the same jagged, desperate lines, but these were even deeper, like whatever had made them was trying to break out from underneath. I crouched down, my heart starting to race. I hadn't paid much attention to the underside of the workbench before. It was just a heavy, old piece of furniture. But now that I was looking at it closely, I saw that the scratches weren't just on the surface. They were all over the underside too, like something had been trapped underneath and had been clawing to get out. A chill ran down my spine, and I stood up quickly, taking a step back. I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for those marks to be there, but there they were, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about them was wrong. I called Sarah into the garage. I didn't want to freak her out, but I needed her to see this, to help me make sense of it. "Hey, can you come here for a second?" I called out, trying to keep my voice casual. She walked in, looking a little wary. "What's up?" I pointed to the workbench. "Check this out. Did you notice these before?" She walked over, leaning down to get a better look at the scratches. Her brow furrowed, and she glanced up at me. "What the hell? No, I definitely didn't see those before. What do you think made them?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but my stomach was doing flips. "I don't know. Maybe it was the previous owner? But they don't look like normal wear and tear, right?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the bench. "No, they don't. They look weird, like something was trying to scratch its way out." I hadn't said it out loud, but hearing her say it made it real. That's exactly what it looked like. Something, or someone had been trying to claw its way out from under the workbench. But that didn't make any sense. It was just an old piece of furniture. Nothing more, right? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. I'm sure there's a logical explanation. Maybe the last guy had some big dog or something that got in here. Or maybe it's just old damage from tools. Sarah didn't look convinced. Yeah, maybe. We stood there in silence for a minute, both of us staring at the workbench. The longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. Those scratches, they weren't made by any tool I'd ever seen. And they were too deliberate, too frantic to have been made by an animal. It looked like someone had been trapped under there, desperately trying to get out. I took a deep breath and forced a smile. "Look, I'll clean it up later. It's probably nothing, just old damage." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Sarah nodded, though, and we left the garage, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. The scratches, the noises from the night before, it was all adding up to something I didn't want to admit, something I wasn't ready to face. That night, as we sat on the couch, trying to relax, I couldn't stop thinking about the workbench. The scratches were burned into my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see them. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew that whatever was happening in that garage wasn't just my imagination. Something had happened there, something I couldn't explain, and whatever it wasn't over. After finding those strange markings on the workbench, I couldn't get the garage out of my head. Every time I walked past the door leading out to it, I'd hesitate for a second, half expecting to hear that scraping sound again. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, but Sarah wasn't helping. She hadn't said much about the scratches since we found them, but I could tell she was still rattled. The tension was hanging in the air, unspoken but heavy. A few days passed without any more weird noises, and I almost convinced myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe the stress of the move was messing with me, or maybe there was a logical explanation I just hadn't figured out yet. But that uneasy feeling never really went away. It was late one evening when things got even stranger. Sarah was upstairs folding laundry, and I decided to organize the garage a bit more. I grabbed a few boxes from the living room, stacking them neatly along the walls of the garage, and then started putting away some of my tools. The space was finally starting to come together, and I was feeling a little better about the whole situation. But as I was getting ready to head back inside, I noticed something odd. The garage door, the big one that opens up to the driveway, was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it, and I was sure it had been closed when I came in. I walked over to it, figuring maybe I hadn't pulled it down all the way, and gave it a firm tug to close it. It slid down easily, and I thought that was that. Then, as I turned to walk away, I heard a loud clunk behind me. I spun around and saw that the door had bounced back up just a few inches, like something had blocked it from closing all the way. I frowned, a little annoyed, and tried again, pulling the door down with more force this time. But the same thing happened. It wouldn't stay shut. It was like something was resisting, forcing it back up no matter how hard I pushed. My first thought was that the sensor was malfunctioning. The automatic garage door had those little sensors at the bottom to prevent it from closing if something was in the way, but nothing was blocking it. I checked both sides, wiping the lenses just in case dust had accumulated, but everything looked fine. I tried again. Same result. The door would come down almost shut and then bounce right back up. I was getting frustrated now, but there was also this creeping feeling in the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. I had used garage doors all my life, and I'd never seen one act like this. It didn't feel mechanical. It felt deliberate, like something was keeping it from closing. I crouched down, shining my phone's flashlight under the door to check for any obstructions. Nothing, just a clean concrete floor. I stood up again and gave the door one last hard pull. It slammed down with a heavy thud, and I waited, holding my breath, expecting it to pop back open again. But this time it stayed shut. I let out a sigh of relief and turned to leave the garage, shaking off the weird feeling that had settled over me. I grabbed the handle of the door that led into the house, but before I could open it, I heard it again, asterisk that sound star. A low, metallic scraping noise coming from right behind me. My body froze. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was making that noise. But I had to. I slowly turned, my eyes scanning the dimly lit garage. Everything looked normal. The workbench, the boxes, the shelves, it was all where it was supposed to be. But that sound, it was coming from the garage door. The same door I had just forced shut. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was still closed, but now I could hear it. The faintest creak of metal, like something was pushing against it from the other side. I stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out what was happening. Was there something outside? An animal? But that didn't make sense. The driveway was empty, and I hadn't heard anything that would explain the noise. Then just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The garage fell into a heavy, unsettling silence. I waited for a moment, my pulse racing, but nothing else happened. No more scraping, no more creaking. Just silence. I didn't want to stay in there any longer. I turned, grabbed the door handle, and stepped back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing. That garage wasn't normal. There was something there, something I couldn't explain. That night, Sarah noticed I was acting weird. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. I didn't want to worry her, but I also didn't want to lie. "Yeah, it's just the garage door acting up. It won't stay shut." She frowned. "That's weird. Maybe the sensor's broken? Yeah, maybe. I'll mess with it tomorrow." But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the sensor. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. That strange presence, that feeling like I wasn't alone in the garage. The noises, the door, the scratches on the workbench. It all added up to something I didn't want to face. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I heard it again. This time, it was softer, almost like a distant whisper, the faint creak of metal coming from the direction of the garage. I tried to ignore it, but the more I tried, the louder it seemed in my mind. Sarah didn't hear it. She was already asleep. But I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't finished with us yet. The next day, I was determined to fix the garage door. I woke up with this knot in my stomach, like something was hanging over me. Sarah was still asleep when I slipped out of bed, threw on some old clothes, and headed straight to the garage. The door was still shut, thank God, but I wasn't about to leave it like that. I grabbed my toolbox and knelt by the sensors, double-checking everything. I wiped the lenses again, tested the wires. Nothing seemed wrong. But the night before had left me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a mechanical issue at all. Something else was messing with the door, something I couldn't explain. I forced myself to ignore that thought and pressed the garage door button. The door creaked to life, sliding up smoothly, no hesitation. I tested it a few times, and it seemed to be working fine. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. That evening, after dinner, the weirdness picked up again. Sarah and I were in the living room, trying to enjoy a quiet night after all the stress of the move. She had made us some tea, and we were curled up on the couch, watching a movie. For a while, it was peaceful. The day had been calm, and the garage door seemed to be behaving itself. I had almost convinced myself that whatever had been going on was over. But as soon as the sun went down, the lights in the garage started acting up. It began with a flicker, just a quick flash that caught the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was the reflection from the TV, but when I glanced toward the hallway leading to the garage, I saw it again, a distinct flicker of light from underneath the door. Sarah noticed it too. "Did the lights just flicker?" she asked, sitting up a little. "Yeah," I said, frowning. "Probably just the old wiring. I'll check the fuse box." I got up and walked toward the garage door, feeling that familiar unease creep up my spine. When I opened the door, the garage was lit up like normal. No flickering. I let out a breath, stepped inside, and walked over to the fuse box. I opened it up, expecting to find something wrong with the breakers, but everything looked fine. I flipped the garage lights off and on a few times, and nothing unusual happened. I was about to head back inside when, without warning, the lights flickered again. This time, it was more than just a flicker. The lights blinked rapidly, almost strobing, and then, just as quickly, they went out completely, leaving me in pitch-black darkness. I froze, my hand still on the light switch. The garage was dead silent, except for my own breathing, which suddenly felt way too loud. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, turning on the flashlight app, the thin beam of light cutting through the darkness. I shined it around the garage, my pulse racing, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Nothing. Everything was where I had left it. The boxes, the tools, the workbench. But the air in the garage felt heavier, thicker, like I wasn't alone. That same eerie feeling from before crept over me. The feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to leave. I reached for the light switch again, flicking it up and down, but the light stayed off. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe the breaker had tripped, or maybe there was a loose wire somewhere. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just an electrical problem. Something else was going on. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, but only for a second. It was just long enough for me to catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Something small, darting behind the workbench. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped the flashlight in that direction, but it was gone. My chest tightened, and I stood frozen, staring at the workbench, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It had been quick, too quick for me to get a good look, but I knew something had moved back there. The silence that followed felt deafening, like the garage was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. I slowly backed away, keeping the flashlight pointed at the workbench. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was a rat or some other animal that had snuck in. That had to be it, right? But that didn't explain the lights or the noises or the scratches on the bench. I reached the door and stepped back into the house, quickly shutting the door behind me. Sarah was waiting in the hallway, her eyes wide with concern. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice nervous. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, just some wiring issues. The lights went out, but I'll figure it out tomorrow." She didn't look convinced, and to be honest, neither was I. But I didn't want to freak her out. The last thing we needed was more stress, especially with all the unpacking still left to do. We went back to the living room, but the mood had shifted. The cozy feeling from earlier was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. Sarah tried to get back into the movie, but I could tell she was distracted, just like I was. Every time I glanced toward the hallway, I half expected to see the lights flicker again, or worse, to hear that scraping noise from before. About an hour later, just when I thought the worst was behind us, the lights in the living room flickered. It was just for a second, but it was enough to make my heart jump. Sarah tensed up beside me. "Did that?" "Yeah." I cut her off, already on my feet. "I'm going to check the fuse box again." I walked down the hallway toward the garage, my pulse quickening. I opened the door and flipped the switch, but the garage light stayed off. I stood there in the doorway, staring into the dark, my phone flashlight in hand, but I couldn't bring myself to step inside again. The image of that small, darting shadow was still fresh in my mind, and the last thing I wanted was to go looking for it. I took a deep breath and closed the door, deciding to deal with it in the morning. As I walked back toward the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the garage wasn't just a garage anymore. It was something else, something wrong, and I had no idea how to fix it. That night, as we lay in bed, the house felt unnervingly still. The flickering lights, the thing I'd seen in the garage, the strange tension in the air, it all added up to something that didn't make sense. Sarah fell asleep after a while, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about that moment in the garage when the lights flashed and I saw something. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to find out. But somehow, I knew that whatever it wasn't finished with us. After the incident with the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house, specifically the garage. It was like there was this constant pressure in the air, a presence that I couldn't see but could definitely feel. Sarah tried to reassure me that it was just the stress of moving, but deep down, I knew it was something else. We spent the rest of that day trying to go about our usual routine, pretending like things were normal, but there was this unspoken tension between us. Every time I walked past the door to the garage, I felt that nagging pull like I should go in and figure out what was really going on. But I didn't. Not after what I thought I saw the night before. I told myself I'd deal with it eventually, but not tonight. I needed a break. We both did. That evening, Sarah and I ordered takeout and decided to have a movie night to try and shake off the weirdness. It was a cozy distraction, and for a little while, things felt almost normal again. But even with the TV on and Sarah by my side, I couldn't fully relax. Every so often, my eyes would drift toward the hallway, half expecting the lights to flicker again or that noise to start up. By the time we finally crawled into bed, exhaustion hit me like a ton of bricks. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been all day, and as soon as I lay down, my body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the mattress. Sarah was already half asleep, and the soft hum of her breathing was oddly comforting. Maybe everything would be fine. Maybe I had blown things out of proportion. Just as I was drifting off, the noise came. At first, I thought it was part of a dream. This low, distant groaning sound, almost like the wind moving through the house. But as I woke up more, I realized it wasn't a dream at all. It was real, and it was coming from the garage. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The noise was soft but unmistakable, like something large was shifting around in the dark. A deep, unsettling moan that seemed to vibrate through the walls, followed by a scraping sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Jag glansade över åt Sara. She was still asleep, completely unaware of the sound that was creeping through the house. I didn't want to wake her. Not yet. I wasn't even sure what was going on. Maybe it was just a pipe creaking or the house settling in the night. I kept telling myself that over and over, but it wasn't working. The noise was too deliberate, too wrong. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. My chest tightened, and I threw the covers off, my feet hitting the cold floor. I didn't want to go check. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay in bed, to ignore it. But I couldn't. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, using its dim light to guide me as I tiptoed down the hallway toward the garage door. The noise grew louder with each step, that same low moaning mixed with the scrape of something dragging across concrete. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and my hands started to shake as I reached for the doorknob. The garage was pitch black when I opened the door. My heart pounded in my ears, and I hesitated for a second, staring into the darkness, my phone's flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the space. The noise stopped. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. I swept the flashlight beam across the garage, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the noise. But everything looked normal. The workbench, the boxes, the shelves, all exactly as I'd left them. And yet, the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't see. I stepped inside, my shoes making soft echoes on the concrete floor. The sound of my footsteps felt unnaturally loud in the stillness of the garage, and with each step, my heart beat faster. I moved toward the back wall, where I thought the sound had come from, shining my light along the base of the workbench. There was nothing out of place, no signs of movement. No animals, no intruders. But then I saw it. The scratches. They were deeper now, long, jagged marks gouged into the wood of the workbench. My stomach turned as I crouched down for a closer look. These weren't the faint, worn scratches I had noticed before. These were fresh, raw, like something had been clawing at the wood, desperate to get out. I took a step back, my heart racing. I wasn't imagining it. Something was in here, something had been trying to get out. But where? I glanced around, my flashlight beam shaking as I scanned the room. Nothing, just the same cold, silent space. Suddenly, the scraping noise started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the garage. It was coming from underneath the workbench. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but there wasn't one. The noise was louder now, unmistakable, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something was clawing its way through the floor. My chest tightened, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over one of the boxes. I had to get out of there. I turned, bolting for the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the noise was gone. The house was quiet again, eerily quiet. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back in that garage. Not tonight. I made my way back to the bedroom, trying to calm myself down. Sarah was still asleep, completely unaware of what had just happened. I crawled in a bed beside her, my mind racing. I wanted to tell her, to wake her up and explain everything, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I didn't even understand? I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the noise to start up again. But it didn't. The house was still, and eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Sarah noticed something was off immediately. "Harrison, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed as we sat down for breakfast. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. Yeah, just didn't sleep well. She didn't push it, but I could tell she knew something was bothering me. And she was right. Something was bothering me. Asterisk a lot star. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the garage, something I couldn't explain. The noises, the scratches, they weren't just random occurrences. They were connected. And whatever it wasn't going away. By the time the next day rolled around, the garage felt like a ticking time bomb. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in there, lurking just beyond my reach. But what was worse was that I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I tried to focus on something else, my mind would wander back to the strange noises, the fresh scratches, and that heavy, suffocating feeling I had felt in the garage the night before. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed oblivious. She noticed I wasn't myself, sure, but I hadn't told her about the latest weirdness. What was I going to say? Oh, hey babe, I think there's something alive underneath the workbench, and I heard it scratching its way through the floor last night. She'd think I was losing it. Hell, maybe I was. That morning, I decided I needed to get out of the house for a while, clear my head. Sarah suggested we go grocery shopping together, get some fresh air, and I agreed. The idea of spending the day away from that garage sounded like a perfect plan. As we were getting ready to leave, I stopped in the kitchen to grab my tool belt from where I'd left it on the counter. It wasn't there. I frowned and checked the living room, then the hallway. Nothing. Hey, Sarah, have you seen my tool belt? I called out, trying to sound casual. She appeared in the doorway, raising an eyebrow. Nope. Didn't you leave it in the garage? No, I'm sure I brought it inside yesterday. It's not out there. I walked through the house, retracing my steps, but the belt was nowhere to be found. My stomach did a little flip as I realized something else. My drill, which had been sitting by the front door, was gone too. And it wasn't just those two things. Over the past few days, I noticed a few other items disappearing. Little stuff. At first, screwdrivers or wrench. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Maybe I misplaced them. Maybe they got lost in the chaos of unpacking. But now it was obvious. Something was taking them. Maybe you left it outside by mistake, Sarah suggested, clearly trying to help, but her words made my skin crawl. Outside? The garage was technically outside, and the last thing I wanted to do was go back in there. I swallowed hard and forced a smile. Yeah, you're probably right. I'll go check. I grabbed my keys and opened the door to the garage, hoping I could just grab my tools and get the hell out of there quickly. But as soon as I stepped inside, that thick, heavy feeling was back, pressing down on me like a weight. The garage was dim, and everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for my tools. The tool belt was gone, and so was the drill. I walked over to the workbench, where I usually kept my stuff, hoping maybe I'd stash them there without thinking. But the workbench was empty, except for a couple of old nails and screws. I checked under the bench, moving boxes and shifting things around, but there was no sign of my tools. That's when I noticed something strange. The boxes I had shoved underneath the workbench the first day we moved in were rearranged. At least, that's what it looked like. They were in a slightly different position, like someone had shifted them around. It was subtle, but enough for me to notice. My heart started racing, and I stood up, glancing around the garage. No one had been in there but me. I crouched down again, looking closely at the floor beneath the workbench. And that's when I saw it, a thin, jagged crack running along the concrete, directly beneath where the scratches had been. It wasn't big, but it was new. I was sure of it. It hadn't been there the last time I checked. The thought hit me like a punch in the gut. Something was under there. I backed away from the workbench, my mind spinning. How could this be happening? There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the foundation was cracked, or the floor was shifting. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something else at play here, something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures of the crack, hoping that maybe Sarah could help me figure out what was going on. But before I could even leave the garage, I heard it again. The scraping. It was faint at first, just a soft, almost rhythmic sound. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it grew louder, more intense. It was coming from beneath the workbench, under the floor. My pulse skyrocketed, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out, to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at that crack in the concrete like it was a portal to something I didn't want to see. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was all in my head. But then I heard a sharp clink, like metal hitting metal, followed by a series of fast, erratic taps. My eyes darted around the garage, and I realized with a sinking feeling what was happening. My missing tools. That was the sound of my tools. They weren't just gone. They were down there, under the floor. I could hear them, rattling and shifting like someone or something was collecting them. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm myself down. My tools weren't just disappearing. They were being taken. But by who? Or what? When I returned to the house, Sarah saw the look on my face immediately. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "The tools, they're gone. And I think something is in the garage, under the floor." She stared at me, confused. "Under the floor? What are you talking about?" I didn't want to sound like I was losing my mind, but I had to tell her the truth. "There's a crack in the concrete. I didn't notice it before, but it's new. And I heard noises. My tools are under there, Sarah. Something is taking them." Her eyes widened, but she didn't say anything at first. I could tell she was trying to process what I had just said. "Harrison, that doesn't make any sense." "I know it doesn't, but I'm telling you, something's wrong with that garage. It's not just the tools. The noises, the scratches, something is in there." Sarah was silent for a moment, and I could see the fear creeping into her expression. "We need to get out of here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, I think you're right." We spent the rest of the day trying to distract ourselves, but the garage was always in the back of my mind. The idea that something had been under there, taking my tools, made my skin crawl. I didn't know what it was, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening for the faintest sound, but the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I kept replaying the events of the day in my mind, trying to piece together what was happening. But nothing made sense. Then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it again, a soft, distant scraping sound coming from beneath the floorboards. Whatever it was, it wasn't done yet.